Welcome to the Joyful Nourishment Podcast. This is a podcast about our relationship with food and eating, body image, eating disorder recovery, mental health, and more. I am your host, Lynn Thorstensen, a registered nutrition therapist and body image coach based in the west of Ireland. And I'm so glad that you're here. So I'm back with another episode of the Joyful Nourishment Podcast. And today I'm here with Lynn, who is a newly graduate psychotherapist with a master's in applied psychology, and she has much experience working with eating disorder. And this is why I invited Lynn to be on the podcast, because she has previously published research on orthorexia, and she's just conducted another study on the topic. So that's really where we're going to focus on our conversation today. Lynn has previously volunteered for Bodywise, and she's also worked in the areas of youth mental health, domestic violence, and disability. And you can connect with Lynn on Instagram at lighthousetherapy_Ireland. So I'm going to link to your Instagram handle in the show notes, but you are very welcome, Lynn. And I'm so excited and so glad that we've connected on Instagram and that we get to have this conversation, because I feel like there was a lot of conversation around orthorexia maybe 6-7 years ago, like when the clean eating kind of moment was getting traction, and when Instagram was in its early kind of days, and when we were all making green kale smoothies and smoothie bowls with frozen berries and all that kind of stuff. And then I feel it's almost like it's kind of seeded into the background a bit. So I think it'd be great to have this conversation because, again, I suppose it's something that could get missed. How would you, like, if you were explaining what orthorexia is, how would you explain it?
Yeah, so basically orthorexia is an obsession, or we use the word obsession, with healthy eating to the detriment of people's physical and mental health. Now, what does that mean? So one of the difficulties with orthorexia is healthy diet actually varies from person to person. So you can have one person with orthorexia who is vegan, and then you can have another person with orthorexia who is carnivore. So it's not actually the quantity or the type of diet. It's not the composition of the diet. It is this obsession, this fear. So they basically have a set of very strict rules they'll follow, and there'll be no deviation. And so if they do happen to have something that's outside their plans, maybe because they get hungry and their diet is not nourishing them enough, they'll feel very, very guilty, very ashamed, and then they'll, as happens with all eating disorders, they will then become stricter and stricter, go back to their strict rules, then they'll break the rules. And then it also causes issues where they're trying not to break the rules, but they live in the world. So they're going to be invited to dinner, or maybe there'll be some family event, or maybe there's some work thing. And that causes terrible stress because they're constantly monitoring the environment for threats to what make them go off this perfect plan. So that's what orthorexia is, and unfortunately it's not in the DSM yet, so it's not an official diagnosis yet, unfortunately.
Yeah. And where do you think, and I often think about that, and obviously as a nutrition professional, you see things with, I suppose, your like how what was in the training, the original training, what sometimes happens in my peer colleague community, and how people are very strict with their diet for health reasons. And how would you sort of define, like, where's the line, or is that kind of from person to person? Like and of course, again, bear in mind that there isn't an official diagnosis.
Well, the funny thing is, there's a few reasons there's not an official diagnosis, but I imagine it will be in the DSM at some stage. I wouldn't say not too long before it is, because in 2022, loads of researchers in the field of orthorexia from a large amount of countries around the world, they met and they came up with this consensus. And one of the things that they emphasize, which I would emphasize too, is it's all about the inflexibility. So, that people can be interested in healthy eating, inverted commas, and people can be foodies. So, but again, someone who's say interested in healthy eating, again, healthy eating, what even is that? That could be a whole other podcast because that very
Yes.
but just say someone finds that they personally feel best on, say, a vegetarian diet. Some people do, some people feel awful on a vegetarian diet, whatever, fine. But the difference is if someone is eating a particular way and they feel good, but it's not a source of stress. So, and if they go to the doctor and the doctor says, oh, you have anemia because you're such and such a diet, they're perfectly willing to try X or Y to help change, maybe improve their anemia. If they're invited out to dinner, that's not a problem. And then the other big thing, this is a big thing, like their diet is not taking up a big part of their life, and they're not going around moralizing and preaching as if it's a religion, telling everyone about their diet. Their diet is just this one part of their life, and that's fine, but it's not a big thing. It's not taking over their lives, and that is one thing that the panel said, that it's not this inverted comma healthy eating, because it goes so far beyond that. It takes over everything, and that's really what makes it different from healthy eating, because it's taken. And then of course the other thing is, as I said, people with orthorexia, even if they do start to develop associated health problems, they'll still keep going with their rules, because their rules have to come first. And they won't listen, even if the doctor is saying, oh my God, I'm worried about your bones, I'm worried about your anemia, I'm worried about whatever. They will still keep going on with their rules until something happens, like I suppose like any issue, until it gets to a certain point.
Yeah. And that sounds like that's where it sort of tangents on like anorexia, right? But it's with orthorexia, it's not about weight per se, it's about the illusion of like health.
Yeah.
But it is really about control in the end of the day, in a sense, though, would you say?
It is about control, but the weight thing, now that's a big unanswered question, because really, at first they thought, so the man who originally came up with the concept was a man called Stephen Bratman, and this was in the late 90s. So he wrote about it in Yoga Journal, it was called. And then later on, not too long, in 2000, he wrote a book. And then the first kind of research on it was in 2004. And so at first the thinking was, oh, it has nothing to do with weight. It's not a weight issue. But then as more research came out, turns out there's some studies saying people with orthorexia really are concerned about weight. There's other studies saying people with orthorexia are trying to lose weight. There's other studies saying people with orthorexia don't care about weight at all. So it's really quite mixed. So it's really up in the air. I think personally that I think some people with orthorexia, it is a weight issue, that they are trying to lose weight by eating a healthy diet, and some it isn't, that they're really just doing this whole clean eating to be healthy. But personally, I think it is a weight issue for many with orthorexia. I really do.
That is really interesting because like what comes to mind in my head then is like for the people who have a body that is probably relatively well fits into the cultural norms and beauty standards of like thinness or smaller body, it might be more that the health piece might be more pronounced. Whereas if you live in a larger body and a body that doesn't fit the cultural norm in terms of what it's supposed to look like, then the weight piece, like it for me intuitively feels like it makes more sense that the weight obsession then really fits into that more. And
Yeah.
whether your body decides to, adhere to that or not, it's sort of like it will do what it needs to do. Like it's fascinating. And I think about like even my own experience, I finished my nutrition therapy studies in 2010, and then Instagram happened in like 2011 or 12, and then this whole like with Instagram, I don't actually know the full background of how it took hold, but all of a sudden everybody was taking pictures of their foods, and then they got prettier, and then all of a sudden it was in this clean eating kind of craze with pretty colorful stuff. But there was like it was quiet, or maybe this was just my experience, but it was like there was sort of, it was a bit disguised in the sense of the restrictive part of it, because it was like all this pretty food and very healthy, but like underneath it, and what's really been really interesting in the last, say, decade is a few people that I would have followed at that time who was like big food bloggers and into whole foods, if you like, and they were vegetarians or vegans, have since come out and said, actually, I had an undiagnosed eating disorder at the time, and I have since, worked on my relationship with food, and it's different. Or some people have been bringing in maybe more meat or dairy products again and sort of changed that. So I just think, that's kind of interesting with how these kind of things have changed. But you said like he was talking about that already in the early 90s or early noughties, which is about another decade prior to we had like social media kind of getting going on that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the funny thing is, so research, you know, moves pretty slowly, which is fair enough. You don't want to throw something, make something a disease that you publish two papers on. I mean, I understand it to an extent, but um, DSM take years to make. So DSM is the basically the manual they use to diagnose mental health conditions, and if something's not in there, it's not actually an official diagnosis. Basically, long and short of it, and it takes years to prepare this big Bible, if you will. And the last edition was 2013, and the man who was the head of the eating disorders section of the DSM said, "Oh, there wasn't enough research in 2009 when he was preparing that." So that's one of the reasons it didn't go into the 2013 edition. However, the very first paper, official academic paper, was 2004. But there's been so much research on it since. There's so much. I mean, the Journal of Eating Disorders, they have an entire section every issue on orthorexia. So there is a lot of research. The other thing that's kind of hampering it getting into being an official diagnosis is up until very recently, there wasn't a good tool basically for, because you can't do blood tests for mental illness. In mental illness is diagnosed by using very specific questionnaires that have been designed over time and such like that. And they tried various versions and they seem to have found two very good ones now. So that's helping the process. So yeah, again, I'm coming back to, I'm just hopeful it will be, because I feel that there are so many people suffering with orthorexia, and because it's like you say, with Instagram and everything, it's so socially approved. And
Yes.
if you can't go to your doctor and get diagnosed with it, how are you ever going to get out of that cycle? Whereas if you go to your doctor and you say, "I'm suffering with this, that, and the other," and it's in a book, they can say, "Oh, that's orthorexia. You've taken this healthy eating too far." So I
Yeah.
think one of the things that feeds orthorexia, no pun intended, it keeps that cycle going of the influencers and the clean eating and all this sort of stuff. Because there is no diagnosis. So it's almost like you're gaslighting yourself. What, I have a condition that's not an official condition.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point to make with any diagnosis, or like people, or certainly a lot of people that I work with. Some people have an official diagnosis often if they're younger, but if they have not had any diagnosed eating disorder in the past, but they've been chronically dieting for 20 years, they're
Mm.
still doing the same behaviors that somebody would fit into the diagnostic criteria, but maybe not as intensely or not as often. But the suffering is no less. And I think that's so important to remember, that your suffering is still valid even if you don't have an official diagnosis. And
Yeah,
sometimes and unfortunately, this is the system we're in. And we talked about this pre-recording. It's like having a diagnosis can be really helpful in order to get access to the support and the care and the treatment that you need. And then if you don't fit that, it's much harder to access. Or like you said, we might end up gaslighting ourselves, thinking, well, I don't have a problem, or my problem is that, say with binge eating, for example, it's like I don't have enough willpower, or that I'm addicted to food, and that's my problem. Not that I have an eating disorder that needs support, and that I continue to restrict food, and why is that, and so forth. So I think it's just important for people to remember. And if you're listening and don't have a diagnosed eating disorder, it doesn't mean that your suffering isn't valid and that you don't, and you still deserve support for things to get better.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I actually personally feel, I think some of my views are maybe considered quite controversial on this, to be honest. But I actually think that a lot of people who would say, or think that they don't meet criteria for an eating disorder actually do. I really think chronic dieting for 20 years, that's probably atypical anorexia, for example. So atypical anorexia is anorexia, however, the person is not clinically underweight. That's the only difference between what's called full threshold anorexia and atypical anorexia. And if you search online, if you're interested in the topic, there's so many stories from people with atypical anorexia who, yeah, suffered for decades, and they just thought, like you say, that they were just chronically dieting, and they had, yeah, I just think there's so much self-blame, and people think, oh, well, I don't have an eating disorder because X, Y, and Z. And it kind of like the fact that most eating disorders are never diagnosed, you
I
know.
agree. Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a whole section, again, I sound like a DSM stan here, but there's a whole section of the DSM in the eating disorder section that it's called OSFED, other specified feeding eating disorder, and in that is things like, it's called something like, binge eating disorder of low frequency, bulimia of low frequency. So, for example, someone who has a very strict diet and then only binges once every 3 months. There you go. That's OSFED.
Yeah.
Someone who only purges, from their strict diet maybe once every few months. Again, so that'd be my contention, that I think the people who are suffering are genuinely suffering and they're not getting the help they need. Um, yeah. So, but as I said,
I think because under OSFED, it's like basically anything that doesn't fit into the other boxes.
yeah.
But I mean, how often do people even, or is that even a consideration? Like,
Mm.
whether that it's you personally thinking, yeah, this is something that happens once in a while, or I diet for, or I restrict for 6 months and then I just can't keep it up. And I just like, that's the problem, that it feels like, yeah, I mean, I think I've heard of one or two people who like had an OSFED diagnosis, but I don't know. I feel like you go into the doctor and you sort of disclose, like they either send you off to somebody else to diagnose. It's like, but I feel a lot of time it's not picked up. And then again, and if you could, I think this feels really like you just talked about atypical anorexia and people being misdiagnosed or not diagnosed and not treated because of higher weight. So like the inherent medical weight bias in the healthcare system is also a huge barrier, I think, for people to get support and treatment and diagnosis, is if that's what you want and need.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well,
Because
very,
it's like because again, right, it comes back to this. I think it was uh there was a study that came out in, was it like 2017 or something, from an Australian team, and the headline was like, what can we learn from um anorexia nervosa, like using behaviors that we diagnosed in one population to treat another. Have you
so
seen that one?
I just wanted to clarify for it because,
Yeah, so there was a study that was done,
yes.
and what they were looking at was how could they learn from the restrictive behaviors from people with a diagnosed anorexia nervosa to use those behaviors to treat people with quote unquote obesity.
Wow.
Yeah, so there is I
Wow.
think it's Deb
Wow.
Regard who says that, like, she calls eating disorders dieting disorders, and it is that kind of, and this is why I find difficult, like I find difficult to understand why other people find this difficult, is like the mental gymnastics to use a set of behaviors to prescribe that to one set of population that is diagnosable in another set of the population, and the biggest difference being weight.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
like and I know we're recording, so I'm kind of totally out myself here, but it makes me so angry, and it's just so morally disgusting.
Yep. Yeah. Especially when you consider that weight, the biggest driver of weight is genetics. Genetics.
Yeah.
And is this some new theory Lynn is coming up with? No, there was so many twin studies done on this for decades. And twins who were rare, like identical twins who were adopted and reared apart. And then as adults, the scientists were studying them, and yes, no matter the environment, their weight was very, very, very similar. Genetics is the biggest driver of weight, followed by hormones. And then smallest predictor of weight is actually diet and lifestyle. So there's a lot of blaming the victim, and there's a lot of, you know, yeah, that if someone in a larger body develops an eating disorder, they're almost always a restrictive eating disorder, they're almost always praised. And that's what a lot of Erin Harrop's work about. If anyone's interested in what I'm talking about, Erin Harrop did her dissertation on atypical anorexia. And the title of it is quite illuminating. And the title of it is Maybe I Really Am Too Fat to Have an Eating Disorder. But she
Mm.
talked to people who had gone without treatment for decades, very, and being praised, even when there are certain signs that are very unique to eating disorders, like um, a lot of specific kind of cardiac issues and a lot of bone issues that just don't occur in women specifically below a certain age. Like if a woman has a bone issues and she's 65, medically that's unfortunate, but more normal. But if a woman has, bone issues and she's 25, that's a massive red flag, for example. But because these women were in larger bodies, none of those stuff were investigated and they weren't helped. And so yeah, it's very, 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 very sad. And just eating disorder services are just not adequate at all, really anywhere, which is why most people with eating disorders globally are not
Yeah.
diagnosed. So that's the statistic there, and that's why I really do. As I said, I understand it might be an extreme view, but I really think chronic dieting is actually an eating disorder. I don't think it's quote unquote normal. I think those people are suffering and they need treatment. And I would love to live in a world where someone who's a chronic dieter would be told by a doctor that, oh, I'm really sorry, but that's not normal, and we're going to get you a treatment team. You'll be seen as a dietitian and a therapist and a doctor, and we're going to help you get better, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. But that's so often not the case.
Yeah.
And like,
Oh, never
and
really.
and yeah, because those are that's a typical a lot of the clients that I work with, and particularly then if you're in a bigger body, you've been told that you're doing the right thing or you should be trying harder. And if it's not working, you're being offered like bariatric surgery or weight loss drugs or something like that. Or people feel like they should want those things. Or if you do go down that road, it's completely understandable that often you feel like that's the only solution because I've tried all the other things. What's I think not often in that picture is that the full consent and the information of all the potential side effects so that you're making an informed choice. But it's just that's the whole challenge around the weight stigma in and the weight bias in the medical trainings. And again, like, even in my nutrition training in my profession, there's a lot of stuff there that is, you know, quite weight centric, and it takes a lot of unlearning for us as professionals, and I think for us as people to do that, particularly in a culture. And I often think about that recovery, whether you're recovering from anorexia or bulimia or binge eating disorder or some variation thereof, that it would be much easier if you were in a culture that weren't so focused on weight and thinness and the link between weight and health, because you have to do all this unlearning yourself, right? And then you go out in the world and it's like sort of subtly reinforcing the message of the eating disorder all over all the time.
Yeah, yeah. I personally think that is the hardest part of eating disorders, um that obviously some people have, a lot of trauma, maybe that caused their eating disorder, but the old thinking on eating disorders was that they were basically caused by deep dark trauma that you need to work through. And while many people are traumatized, and perhaps that is the root of eating disorders for some people, for other people it's actually not a deep dark trauma at all. It is the world we live in, as you say, the societal fat bias, it is a massive, massive thing. And the fact that, research has demonstrated now that people that are most at risk of eating disorders are people who are overweight or obese. They're actually
Yeah.
the most at risk of developing an eating disorder. And you can see why. Of course, they're judged every day.
Yeah. And because we know that dieting is the leading predictor of somebody developing an eating disorder, disordered eating. Like, so even if you don't end up with a full-blown eating disorder, if you keep at the dieting, your relationship with food is going to be messed up because that's just the nature of it.
Mhm.
Particularly if you keep at it. Whereas there's those odd unicorns to kind of, they tried once and go, "Ah, wasn't for me," and that's it. They
Yeah.
never like it didn't really put a dent. And you said something earlier also around like the personality type of people who are maybe most likely to be vulnerable to develop an eating disorder and maybe orthorexia in particular. Like what would you think is like, and from the research that you have done, kind
Yeah.
of puts people in that vulnerability position?
So with orthorexia specifically, the research is quite interesting. The people most likely to develop orthorexia specifically are people who are higher in neuroticism. So if people don't know what that is, neuroticism is just a fancy way of saying emotional. So the sort of people who would be, highly sensitive types that, they get hurt more easily, they get more depressed more easily, they get anxious about things. That's what neuroticism is. So people who are higher in neuroticism and people who are perfectionists. And then interestingly enough, there's also a correlation between people again, this goes back to the sensitivity though, that people who are sensitive to societal messaging around weight and body image. I thought that's a very interesting personality characteristic when I read that. And then the other one is that people who would be quite obsessive, orderly sort of people. So this sort of again, that would be quite common with a lot of these eating disorders. People who like things to be neat and tidy and organized. And I don't just mean a physical presence. I mean they like their life to be
Mm,
organized and planned and because there's a lot of orthorexic features are quite ritualistic. Do you know what I mean? Like, I have to have this many this, I have to have this food group, and I have this rule and that rule. It is very orderly in a
yeah.
dysfunctional way, of course.
Yeah. I mean, there might be a point where that is fine, but it's like what you said earlier as well. It's okay to have a certain structure if that's what feels good, but it's like if it becomes so inflexible
Yeah.
that like now it's just like it really impacts on the rest of your life because food is such a big part of our like life. It's not just the nourishment of the like that we eat to have our bodies function well, but it's also like how we socialize. It's connection with our culture, it's connection with the earth. Like there's so many parts that are woven into that it's that I think that also brings its own challenge in the recovery to make, you know, what does that look like then to broaden that flexibility a bit so that it doesn't impinge on one's overall quality of life.
How would a person recover? Is that what you mean? Or
Yeah, so I mean, in the sense of like, if you get stuck in that, like, so now you can't go out with your friends and socialize, or family dinners means that everything has to be cooked in a specific way. And, if you're trying to feed other people in your household, but like it makes, eating disorder tends to make our lives smaller because, we don't want to go outside. So like, bringing like working out of that so that now like you said earlier is like if you turns out you are anemic and maybe you need to bring in some animal products for example, or even just being able to go out and socialize without that being a major psychological stress.
yeah. Yeah, see, it is all about the inflexibility. That word's been mentioned quite a lot in the literature on orthorexia. It's the inflexibility. You can have any diet you like if it makes you feel good, you like the food, that's great. But if your friend says you want to go out here, It's not a big problem. It's not a stress. You're not going to be thinking about it. Oh, you go to the restaurant, they don't have the sort of food you normally have. Okay, well, I'll have something else. Everything's very casual, everything's very relaxed, and you're not thinking about it. You know what I mean? You're going around, maybe you're driving to work, you're going to work, you're picking up the kids, you're planning your holidays. Food is just something you really don't think. That's another big thing. Food should not be something that's taking up really much space in your brain, apart from when you're shopping at the supermarket or you're cooking or you're hungry. But it shouldn't be something that's constantly in the back of your mind, like a broken record playing over, like those very old, what were they called? Was it a gramophone where the record,
Mm-hmm.
like one of that, where the record would just be stuck over and over and over. And that's
Yeah.
what all like all day, every day, calculation, calculation, calculation.
Yeah. Yeah. And with most eating disorders, I think there is like that. And I heard a term, or I read it recently. I'd never heard it before, but they talked about food noise.
Yes.
And that was a new to me term, but I was like, yeah, that kind of describes it, like how pervasive it is. And I think for people who've never had that experience, it's really, really difficult to imagine what that it's like. But when you're in it, it's just really all consuming, I think.
Mhm. The food noise is an interesting one because that is something that, can be a big part of, say, orthorexia or any eating disorder where, you have a disordered eating or an eating disorder, and that's why. But it can also occur in other conditions, like, for example, there's a lot of controversy about these weight loss drugs, but a lot of that is to do with the marketing of them. They originally started as drugs for diabetes, and some of them are quite old. Like the original one was put out 20 years ago, and certainly diabetics would talk about when they're insulin resistance, or so women with PCOS would talk about their insulin resistance, and diabetics obviously would talk about their blood sugar, but it's all a continuum really between insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. They're on the same road. And people who are using these drugs for, medical conditions like diabetes or insulin resistance, that's one of the things that they talk about, that basically that they didn't have orthorexia, but that actually they just were hungry because everything was being messed up because their blood sugar was so out of balance, and it wasn't the way it's supposed to be. So that's my only caveat. So food noise can be caused by an eating disorder, but sometimes it can be actually caused by a physiological issue that, and again, I think that's something that's often not picked up, that when you have untreated insulin resistance, you can be, not everyone with it, but you can be very, very hungry and you can really not feel good. But again, you'd often have that problem where if your blood sugar and your glucose is not in the diabetic range yet, you might be told it's all in your head. So then that creates a vicious cycle where you really do think it's in your head, and then that can end up with disordered eating. So really, and actually, funny enough, it is a bit of an offshoot here, but like PCOS, for example, there was a rate of eating disorders or disordered eating in one large study was 80%, which
Wow.
makes complete sense to me because of the physical impact of, if your PCOS is not under control and your insulin and blood sugar is all over the place, you're not going to feel good. So that makes sense to me. And then the other part of it is that, you know, one of the main symptoms of PCOS is unexplained weight gain out of nowhere. And so then people start with the disordered eating and the diet and the eating disorders. So yeah, so the
Yeah.
food one can be both. It can be this torturous thing that truly is because you're starving your body, but it can also be a more complex thing that's also got to do with blood sugar and insulin and stuff. So that's why I'd be a big fan of like a holistic care for an eating disorder, as in like, dietitian, therapist, and a doctor all working together. And that is what's considered best practice. But unfortunately,
Yeah, but like how
yeah,
many people, and I laugh at this, right? And I'm in private practice. I mean, again, unless you are fortunate to get a diagnosis, first of all, or you can pay for the diagnosis privately and get the person a referral to the practitioner who can do the diagnosing. And then you have to get access into the system. And then you have to fit the boxes and usually there might be weight criteria as well. And if you're not thin enough or your body weight isn't low enough, then you're like not sick enough. And that feeds to the eating disorder. So like, for anybody who's like outside of that, having that full team is really difficult. Like some of my clients that I work with have therapists alongside the work that I do, which is great because it's like ideal scenario, I think, and you have two professionals. And if you're paying privately, that's a certain expense that not maybe everybody can carry. And then sometimes I find how it often works with the people that I work, it's like that it's kind of like a tandem in the sense of people might have done a certain amount of therapeutic work on other areas of their life, and maybe their therapist wasn't trained in eating disorders or disordered eating. So that like that came to light, and then they end up with somebody like me and we work on that stuff. Or they might end up coming to me first to the sort of nutritional entry point, and we work on the relationship with food and maybe some other underlying stuff, like it could be relationships issues or marriage issues, or there could be unresolved childhood trauma, or something else might come along. And you can see that, right, this is also kind of like fanning the flame, like we've done all this work, but there's something else, or just it just comes up, and then people move on from my work to a therapist to continue on with that. So that's in my clinical practice and experience, it often looks like that in the space that I'm in. But I would love for everybody to have a multidisciplinary team to work. But it feels like unless you are in that minority with a restrictive eating disorder, that it's become quite bad, and you're sort of either heading for hospitalization, you're in a hospital, or you just, that's kind of like where some of that structure seems to be in place. Other than that, good luck. You have to cobble your own team together, or if you're like, we talked about people with chronic dieting before. It's like often when people have gotten to a place where it's like rock bottom and they don't know where to go, and that's when they end up like with me or with somebody similar or with a therapist to work through some of that stuff. But this is like, it's not new.
Yeah, I mean, that's the great tragedy of it all. Like, globally, it's recommended best practice is a team of a doctor or a psychiatrist, depending on which you prefer yourself. A dietitian, nutritionist, and then a therapist. That's what's recommended. And even the HSE in their position paper on eating disorders, like the eating disorder program and stuff, they talk about this. But exactly what you said, people do. I have known people who have done that, but they're coming from a place where they've got supportive. It's usually parents, because even if the person is in a relationship or married, generally your parents might be retired and they might have savings and stuff. So you'll have parents or family members that are aunts or uncles who are paying for this person to have that team, because you're exactly right. That's what people need. That's what best practice shows. But so many people can't get that. And again, coming back to the suffering, like, I'm not sitting here saying that chronic dieting is, oh, there's loads of academic literature on how it should be. I'm saying that I personally think it should be classified as an eating disorder, simply because so many people with chronic dieting actually do fulfill eating disorder criteria in the OSFED category, but they're not getting diagnosed. And the suffering they go through is unbelievable. I mean, people are suicidal. This is, it's just horrendous. And, a big part of the reason is again, I keep coming back to, a big part of the reason is the, societal, like society, basically, like society's, emphasis on thinness as your worth. And it's very difficult because, Gwyneth Allman, she doesn't anymore, but she used to have quite an active website on eating disorders. But she wrote an article one time about, is it Your Utopia or something? But is the name of the website. But she talked about, that only something, a tiny percentage, something like 5%, 10%, maybe, I think it's more like 5 to 10%, I can't remember exactly, of women have a BMI naturally of 19, 20. So for those not in the know, if you have a BMI of 19, 20, that means you're not too far from being clinically underweight, and you're almost certainly in the lowest dress sizes that you could buy in stores. You're at the societal level of very, very slim. But this is the ideal. So again, that's kind of coming back to, well, one can see how people who are naturally that way, are less likely to develop eating disorders because they're not ever going to have the pressure in the same way. Now, of course, I'm not saying these people are not ever going to feel bad because we live in the world we live. So they might say, oh, I don't like my thighs, I don't like my arms, whatever. But they're not ever going to be in the same pressure. They're certainly not going to go to a doctor with an itchy leg and be told they need to lose weight, or be told that they can't have surgery until they lose weight. Or, I mean, terrible stories you hear about people going for a run and people making fun of them because they're larger. These are things that are not going to happen to someone who's a BMI of 19 or 20. So you can see how they're just not as vulnerable to eating disorders.
Yeah, like the way I think, yeah, what you're talking about is the anti-fat bias and the weight stigma that is there as well, and how that really impacts our relationship with food, eating in our bodies, and like the cultural pressure. And I remember, I think there's a book I was reading that came out, I don't know, something in the 90s, and it's called Moving Away from Dieting. It's like kind of on the intuitive eating spectrum, but they do go through this, made up person story. And they talk about, say, Alice, and when she was young and whatever, and there's some chaos in the family and stuff, and she started using food to cope with that, and food is available maybe as a way of taking care of herself when other emotional support wasn't available. That's all grand until Alice gets to a stage either in puberty or later on in life she gains some weight. So she's been using food as a way of coping. And I know we weared off from the orthorexia topic here, but it's not until the weight is seen as a problem. And of course, this can happen at any stage on that trajectory. It could happen when the kid is 5 or 6 years old, or it can happen when you're 15 or 16, or you could be in your early 20s. And then it's like, okay, now now it's like the weight now is a problem. Like the coping with food wasn't such an issue in the sense until the weight became an issue. And now we layer on top of with the dieting and the binge restrict cycle, or if you're unlucky again, you happen to have a body that once you lose a certain amount of weight, now eating becomes harder and you end up in a restrictive eating disorder instead. So it's like, which is where again, I think we have to like continuous to chip away at dismantling this anti-fat bias that we have in society, because yes, it might not be ideal if we're using food as our only coping tool, but it seems to be a bit like, when you have people smoking and they're thin, it's almost like it's not seen as big of a health issue, even though it still is for that individual. Of course, if they want to smoke, they can smoke. But if they don't look what we are all sort of indoctrinated what health looks like, I thin, then it's almost like, yeah, it's not that bad. Do you know what I
Yes,
mean?
yes, and for example, smokers are rarely denied care. The only exception to that rule is certain surgeries. They are, because there are certain surgeries where it's extremely dangerous. The risk of death or serious complications if you smoke is way, way higher. Um, but that's pretty much it. And to be fair to the surgeons, they have a very good reason. They want to make sure the person comes out of the surgery alive or not ferociously disabled. So there's a lot of logic to that. But otherwise, smokers are not denied care. You can make the argument that they're treated badly because, obviously you're not out smoking indoors and they're even on hospital grounds and stuff. So I do understand that argument personally. I really do. But you're right. They're not experiencing the same stigma at all, and that people who are living in larger bodies are absolutely. And I know we have kind of veered off when we're talking about antifa, but that's because certainly the research on orthorexia is pretty interesting. That um, it really does seem to be a factor in a lot of people with orthorexia, that it is a means to lose weight or control the weight for a lot of people. Now, I don't think that's everyone with orthorexia, so I imagine that maybe it'll be a thing where it's a category. Maybe one of the criteria is desire for weight loss, but not everyone has that, and that's fine.
Yeah,
But I do think it plays a significant role in orthorexia because it's been documented repeatedly in studies. So yeah.
that's so interesting. And I feel like, again, if you're in a smaller body, it's easier for the healthy eating to turn into orthorexia because of whatever, trying to manage a health condition or a sense of control or whatever. and it not being about weight as such. But if you're in a larger body, it feels more intuitive to me that it becomes about weight or weight loss as well, because that's the kind of cultural messaging and again, the weight bias. And then it's like that sort of reinforcing of these messages over and over that you're doing well or you're doing something that's good when it's become a huge problem in your life, like when it's sort of passed through that, when the flexibility is gone and your relationship with food is no longer, enjoyable and, nourishing in every way, right? So,
Yeah.
so is there anything like, Lynn, that's, how do people like, what's the way out of it? Like, how can people get better? Like, how can you heal from the orthorexia?
Well, first, I thought I'd just say quickly that something that has occurred to me, if you're listening to this and you're wondering, oh, do I have orthorexia? Could I have a problem? One other thing to think about is, yes, the inflexibility. The other thing to think about is time. How much time are you spending thinking about food, and making the perfect grocery list, making the perfect meals, hanging out on forums is a big thing. Are you on Facebook groups for healthy eating? Are you constantly on Instagram? You can find yourself in these little groups. So that's another thing, that if it's taken up half your life, that's a sign. But in terms of getting out, so as amazing as it is to stand here in 2023 and say, or 24, oh my God, I'm still getting used to the oh my God. But it's as amazing as it is to sit here and say 2024, but there has not yet been even one study on treatment for orthorexia. And again, that's because they've been spending their time, trying to figure out, what's the right test for it and find out symptoms and stuff like that. But the one of the things that has been said is basically things that have been shown to be helpful to all eating disorders are probably going to be helpful for orthorexia. So, personally, so there's a lot of really good research saying that intuitive eating, and sort of doing body positivity slash body neutrality work can be very helpful, because again, there is that link to weight and body image that a lot of people think orthorexia is not about that, but unfortunately it does appear to be for a lot of people. So intuitive eating work seems to be one of the things. And then also I would say to anyone in general listening to this who has disordered eating slash eating disorder, that if you're going to go for therapy or you're going to go for help, go to someone who says on the website or on wherever you're looking that they have experience with intuitive eating, health at every site, those sort of things, because um, unfortunately, if you don't know what you're doing and you're treating someone with an eating disorder and you don't have any training in anti-fat bias, any training in diet culture, any training in any of this, you can actually do great harm. I suppose the best way of putting it, maybe it would be like, things are very different. Everyone's, mental health professionals are well educated on depression nowadays, but maybe 60 years ago, I don't know. I wasn't around then, but maybe if you went to a therapist back in the day, maybe they would just say, "I you'll be grand, haven't you got a lovely home with lovely children?" I think there was that attitude actually. Um,
Mm,
so I feel like, you're pretty safe with most therapists and doctors and stuff for going to say help with depression. Although obviously nothing is perfect, absolutely there are issues, but the great harm that can be done with eating disorders is really there. So my big thing would be, if you're going for help with orthorexia or any eating disorder, really make sure that they are certified, basically, that they're not just someone who only has, not that only, it's a big deal to get a therapy degree, but you want to make sure they're certified because it is very specialized work.
yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I think it feels like the anti-fat bias, or like, and for us as professionals having to do our own work really around that, even more so, I think if you live in a smaller body and don't have a lived experience of externalized weight stigma. I think most of us have internalized shit that we picked up along the way, but in that sense, because yeah, you can do great harm. And I'm very grateful for my clients have been teaching me and that I have learned from about their lived experience and what it is like, unfortunate what it is like how people make judgments and comments just by how they present in the world, which is I don't agree with.
Well,
So yeah,
kind of going along with that, there's a really brilliant pediatric eating disorder specialist in America called Dr. Rebecca Peebles, and she once gave a talk to clinicians. And she said, and I quote, and I thought this is brilliant, this woman really gets it. She said to the clinicians, "You must not be afraid of what the eating disorder is afraid of." In other words, those doctors don't have eating disorders, but they have the same terror of gaining weight the children with eating disorders that they're treating of. And she was saying, you need to wake up. You've got the
yeah.
same thing. You need to recognize that and you need to not put that onto your patient.
Yeah, and it's pretty common. Like you hear some real horror stories as well, and
Yeah.
how people in bigger bodies are treated in, in treatment centers and such. I don't know what it looks like in Ireland, but I wouldn't imagine it's that much different. And I think yeah, that is a huge, huge point. Because again, like, yeah, it's not like we have to get people to the point where their body wants to be and where their bodies are well nourished, and their brain are well nourished and things are functioning well. And wherever that body might land on that, it should be fine. And I also have a really hard time sometimes with professionals who are saying, well, I support people in their healing their relationship with food or recovering from binge eating disorder. And then once they've done that, we can work on the weight stuff, like as in weight loss. And I'm like, okay. I don't understand the mental gymnastics on that actually either. And to be clear, I had many years ago, my first business cards over a decade ago, they said like lose weight without dieting. And when I learned all this stuff and the harms of these things, I took a scissors and the ones I had left and I cut them up. So again, it's not like, most of us are trained in as professionals in weight-centric practices. All of us live in this weight-centric, hyper-focused world on health and thinness. So it takes this radical unlearning to move away from that. But I think as if we are supporting other people, it's our duty of care to really work and unlearn our own internal anti-fat bias. And that's an ongoing practice and work, I think. It's ongoing.
Yeah, I think about this. There's very few things that are good about the label obesity. I don't like. I'm only using that word because it describes a particular thing, but I think it's been used to stigmatize people. But the only upside of that word is that because there's this move now that obesity is like a medical condition. So because of that, there's a lot more research going on to how do medical professionals deal with obesity, and they're finding massive rates of stigma. So now the consensus is we need to stop doctors being so stigmatized. Instead of seeing obesity as like a fatal flaw, that it's like, their thinking is it's a medical condition, whereas I think it's actually just the spectrum
Body
of
diversity.
body
Yeah.
type. But it's still a little bit of improvement because what it's meaning now is that there is this move to train doctors to not be biased against people who are living in larger body and to not deny care. I mean, both private and public systems around the world deny care routinely to people if they don't meet a certain BMI, and it's absolutely scandalous. It's absolutely scandalous that people of a certain size, are not entitled to care according
Yeah.
to the systems, because again, it rests on the belief that weight is very easy to control and that the only reason people are overweight is because they are sitting down having takeaway every single night, and that's just what it is, and they just need to eat a inverted commas balanced diet and they will wake up being, again, inverted commas, normal weight. So that's why this is put, because And it's very much again, it wasn't Albert Einstein, it was someone else. It's always Albert Einstein that's quoted. It's not actually him, but he said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. I mean, we all know diets don't work. And
Yeah.
I think certainly in my most recent study, the participants, one of the big things that came out was the participants said that one of the things that kept the orthorexia going was they were getting so much praise from people. And even when they started to think, hang on a second now, I think there's something wrong. I don't think there's something quite right with me. It was very hard because they were like, oh my God, you're so great. Like, look at you there eating this, that, and the other. Aren't you so great? So,
Yeah.
it's cycle kept going by society. Orthorexia is very, you know, very encouraged by society.
Yeah,
Very.
it's very socially sanctioned. And then on top of that, in today's world, we now have like social media that just, if it's not encouraging it, it's amplifying it. So it's, I don't think that can be sort of brushed aside either. I think it has to be recognized that that is a big part of it as well. So, Lynn, I think this has been a really great conversation. And I know there's like way more questions that I have and things that we can talk about. Maybe we have to do a second one at some point. But I always ask all my guests, I should say, what does joyful nourishment mean to you?
I would sum up joyful nourishment in one word: freedom. Freedom to eat a diet that feels good to your body, freedom to go places with family and friends, and freedom to be free in your own head and not be thinking and calculating food 24/7. So freedom, that's what it means. It means freedom, because without freedom, how can you ever be joyful? How can you ever
Yeah.
really live life? How can you ever really be comfortable in your body?
Yeah, that's really important. Yeah, thank you. I just love hearing people's answers. Because they could vary. There's similar themes, but I just love how people answer that question. So thank you. And again, reminders where people can find you if they want to follow you, check out the work that you're doing.
Yes, so Lighthouse Therapy _Ireland. I am on Instagram. Yes, and that's where you can find me at the moment.
We'll see what the future holds. Who
Yeah,
knows? Now you're finished with your degree, so that's exciting.
I was going to say, I'll have a website and everything, but I don't have that right now because it's very, what's the word? It's very current.
Yes, no, it's good. And whenever that might happen in the future, I'm sure we'll touch base. So thank you again so much, Lynn, for coming on.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. The Joyful Nourishment podcast is produced with no financial backing, and your support means a lot to keep this project going. If this episode has been helpful in any way, please consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on. This helps the podcast to be found by others. And of course, you can also forward this episode to a friend whom you think may benefit. Find out more about what I offer on straightforwardnutrition.com, and if you're interested in working with me, please use the link in the show notes to book in for a free initial 30-minute session. And finally, please come and join the Joyful Nourishment community over on Substack, unless you're there already, by subscribing to my newsletter using the link below.